Part 2, The Shilling Book, April and May. Chapter 5. I have a new exercise book, the finest I ever saw. It cost a whole shilling. Stephen got Miss Marcy to buy it in London last week. She went up on a cheap day ticket. When he gave it to me, I thought I would write something like Wuthering Heights in it. I never dreamt that I would want to go on with this journal. And now life has begun all over again. I am up on Belmont. Spring has come with such a bound that catkins are still dangling on the hazels, while daisies are rushing out on the mound. I particularly love them in the short, brilliant grass of the motte, where they look like spring in a child's picture book, as well as the real spring. There are daffodils down in the courtyard garden, but I can't see them from here because the washing is flapping. Topaz keeps coming out with more and more things to peg up, and they are all in part of the exciting happenings. I have been leaning back against the tower, quietly gloating, watching the dazzling white clouds move past. There is quite a breeze, but a soft, almost summery one. It is 6 weeks to the day since Topaz and I stood on Belmont in the dusk with life at its lowest ebb, though it ebbed a great deal lower afterwards. At first, only Topaz and I were miserable. It was a terrible strain not to show it. We used to slip off for long walks together and let our faces fall. Rose's exuberance lasted about 10 days. Then she began to feel something else ought to happen. I staved her off for about another week by suggesting Mrs. Cotton's arrival must have kept her sons busy. Then the blow fell. Miss Macy told us that the vicar had gone over to call and had been asked to lunch, and that various Scoutney people had been invited there. But no one but the vicar from Godsend? I said hastily. But there is no one else in Godsend they would ever ask except us. Your turn next, dears, said Miss Macy. Rose got up and walked straight out of the kitchen. That night, after we were in bed, she suddenly said, "Ask Miss Blossom what went wrong, Cassandra." I was absolutely stuck. I felt I ought to edge in some advice for the future, but I couldn't see how, without telling the brutal truth. "She says she doesn't know," I said at last. I didn't make Miss Blossom say it herself because I think of her as very sincere. "I expect it's because we're so poor," said Rose bitterly. Then she sat up in the iron bedstead. It was my week for the four-poster, and said, "I was so nice to them, really I was." I saw my chance and said in Miss Blossom's voice, "Perhaps you were too nice, dearie." "But I wasn't," said Rose. "I was charming. But was I? Oh, capricious, contradictory. Isn't that what men like?" "You just be natural, girlie," said Miss Blossom. Then I went on in my own voice. "How much did you really like them, Rose?" "I don't know. But I know I don't like them now." "Oh, I don't want to talk about it." And that was all she ever did. Talk about it. That was almost the worst part of the gloom, our not talking naturally. Never have I felt so separate from her, and I regret to say that there were moments when my deep and loving pity for her merged into desire to kick her fairly hard. For she is a girl who cannot walk her troubles off, or work them off. She is a girl to sit around and glare. Topaz was wonderfully patient, but I sometimes wonder if it was only patience, but also a faint resemblance to cows. It is rather like her imperviousness to cold. Father once said she had a plush-lined skin, and there are times when I think she had a plush-lined feelings. But they certainly aren't plush-lined where Father himself is concerned. 3 weeks ago, I found her crying in the buffer state in front of her portrait of him, for which he never sits. It is mostly orange triangles. She said his disappointment was far more important than Rose's, that he had so much enjoyed meeting Simon Cotton, and was longing to talk about the American essay on Jacob's wrestling, particularly how he's changed his mind about it. He now thinks he did mean all the things the critics say he did, and I was sure it was starting him writing. But I've just sneaked into the gatehouse while he's over at the vicarage, and what do you think he's working on? Crossword puzzles! I suggested there might be money in crossword puzzles. Not that kind, said Topaz. They didn't make sense, Cassandra. What is the matter with him? I had an almost dreadful thought. I wondered if father really had been drinking for years, if he had found a secret wine cellar under the castle, or was making drink out of something. I don't know. There is some stuff called wood alcohol. Oh, don't be idiotic, said Topaz. You can tell if men are drinking. We must be patient. It's just that he's a genius. She then went to bathe her eyes, and when she put on her favorite dress, which is cream satin damask, Italian, just about dropping to pieces, she wears a little ruby red cap with it. Then she went down to make potato cakes for tea. I was in the garden, looking at a daffodil that was almost out, when father came back from the vicarage. Any news? I called to be friendly. Only that it appears to be quite a distinction not to be asked to Scotney. I gather invitations are being broadcast. He said it in his loftiest manner, then gave me a quick little embarrassed smile and added, I'm sorry, child, you know what the trouble is, don't you? I stared at him and went on. It's the rent. They've looked into that little matter? I know because the usual application didn't come in on March quarter day. Oh, they're kind enough. The best type of American always is, but they don't want to get involved with us. I knew Topaz hadn't told him the truth, partly because she thought it would upset him and partly because she had a sort of woman must stick together attitude. I wondered if I ought to tell him myself, and then I decided that if he did feel guilty about the rent, it would be a good thing. Anything to prod him into working. But as he stood there, in his thin old coat, with the March wind blowing his fading golden hair, I felt very sorry for him. So I told him there were potato cakes for tea. As it turned out, the potato cakes were spoilt, because while we were eating them, we had one of those family rows which are so funny in books and on the pictures. They aren't funny in real life, particularly when they happen at meals, as they so often do. They always make me shake and feel rather sick. The trouble arose because Thomas asked Rose to pass the salt 3 times, and she took no notice. And when he shouted at her, she leaned forward and boxed his ears. Topaz said, Blast you, Rose, you know Thomas gets an earache. And Rose said, You would bring that up. I suppose he'll die, and I'll be responsible. Father said, Damnation! And pushed his chair back onto Heloise, who yelped, and I said, I can't stand it! I can't stand it! Which was ridiculous. Stefan was the only person who kept calm. He got up quietly to see if Heloise was badly hurt. She wasn't, and she came off very well because we gave her most of the potato pancakes. Our appetites came back later, when there was nothing worth eating. Food isn't much better in spite of Stefan's wages coming in regularly, because we have to go slow until the tradesman bills are paid off. Stefan keeps back a shilling a week. This exercise book came out of his savings. I have an uneasy feeling he will spend most of them on me. He certainly spends nothing on himself. He hasn't brought me any poems lately, which is a relief. That evening, the row was our lowest depths. Miserable people cannot afford to dislike each other. Cruel blows of fate call for extreme kindness in the family circle. Had we but known it, our fortunes were already slightly on the mend, for that was the very day father's Aunt Millicent died. How dreadfully callous I sound, but if I could bring her back to life, truly I would. And as I can't, there seems to be no harm in thanking God for his wondrous ways. For she left Rose and me her personal wardrobe, which means clothes, not a piece of furniture as I thought at first. When the vicar saw the death announcement in the Times, we entertained a faint hope that she might have left father some money. But she had cut him out of her will and left everything to a hostel for artists' models. I suppose she thought they ought to stick in the hostels and not go marrying her relations. Just think, said Rose, if father hadn't married Topaz, we might be rolling in wealth by now. And I asked myself if I would rather roll than have Topaz in the family, and decided I wouldn't, which was nice to know. After the first exuberance had worn off, we remembered that Aunt Millicent was 74 and an eccentric dresser. But to be left anything at all gives one a lift. The lawyers wrote asking us to come to London and pack the clothes ourselves. They said they would pay all expenses. The prospect of a day in London was heaven, but the problem of what to wear was sheer hell, particularly for Rose. My clothes don't bear thinking about, so I just don't think about them. We sponged and pressed our winter coats and tried to believe they looked better. And then the weather turned fine. Those coats were utterly revolting in the brilliant sunshine. I had a sudden idea. Let's wear our old white suits, I said. Aunt Millicent had them made for us just before the row about father marrying Topaz. They are some kind of silky linen, very plain and tailored. Of course, they have had very hard wear, and mine is too short, though it has been let down to the last quarter-inch. But they are much the nicest things we have, and by a miracle had been put away clean. They'd be all right if it was midsummer, said Rose, when we tried them on. But in April? Still, we decided to wear them if the fine weather held. And when we woke up yesterday, it was more like June than April. Oh, it was the most glorious morning. I suppose the best kind of spring morning is the best weather. Mr. Stebbins lent Stephen his cart to drive us to the station, and even the horse seemed to be enjoying himself. Did you ever see the sky so high? I said. And then I felt ashamed to be so happy, knowing that I couldn't have been if Aunt Millicent had stayed alive, and it probably hurt her to die, poor old lady. We were driving through Godsend, and the early sun was striking the moss-grown headstones in the churchyard. I tried to realize that I shall die myself one day, but I couldn't believe it. And then I had a flash that when it really happens, I shall remember that moment and see it again. The high Suffolk sky over the old Godsend graves. Thinking of death, strange, beautiful, terrible, and a long way off, made me feel happier than ever. The only depressing thing was seeing Scoutney Hall through the trees, and that only dampened me on Rose's account, for what care I for the Cottons? Anyway, what cared I then? I was careful to avoid her eye until we were well past the park, spending 2 tactful minutes buttoning a one-buttoned shoe. We got to Scoutney Station in good time. Rose thought we should take first-class tickets, as the lawyers would pay. But suppose they don't pay at once? I said. We had Stephen's wages to see us through the day, but Topaz was counting on getting them back. In the end, we just took cheap day tickets. Stephen kept begging me to be careful of the traffic. He even ran along with the train to remind me again. Then he stood waving, smiling, but a bit wistful looking. It struck me that never in his life has he been to London. It was queer how different things felt after we changed from our little toy train at King's Crypt. The feel of the country went. It was as if the London air was trapped in the London train, and our white suits began to look peculiar. They looked much more peculiar when we got to London. People really stared at us. Rose noticed at once. It's because they admire our suits, I said, hoping to soothe her. And I did think they looked nicer than most of the drab clothes women were wearing. We look conspicuous, she said, with deep shame. Little did she know how much more conspicuous we would look before we got home. It was 3 years since we had been in London. We never knew it well, of course. Yesterday was the first time I ever walked through the city. It was fascinating, especially the station's shops. I could look at the stationers' shops forever and ever. Rose says that they are the dullest shops in the world, except perhaps butchers. I don't see how you can call butchers' shops dull. They are too full of horror. We kept getting lost and having to ask policemen, who were all rather playful and fatherly. One of them kindly held up the traffic for us, and a taxi driver made kissing noises at Rose. I had hoped the lawyer's office would be old and dark, with a Dickensy old lawyer, but it was just an ordinary office, and we only saw a clerk who was young with very sleek hair. He asked us if we could find our way to Chelsea by bus. No, said Rose quickly. He said, "Okay, take a taxi." I said we were a little short on change. Rose flushed scarlet. He gave her a quick look and then said, "Wait a sec," and left us. He came back with £4. "Mr. Stevenage says you're to have this." he told us. It'll take care of your fares, taxi to Chelsea, taxi to get the stuff to the station, and a slap-up lunch. And you must nip back here with the key of the house and sign the receipt. See? We said we saw and went. Rose was furious that no one more important than a clerk had bothered to see us. It's not respectful to Aunt Millicent, she said indignantly, treating us like small fry. I didn't mind what kind of fry I was, with 4 pounds in hand. Let's find our way by bus. And save the taxi money, I suggested, but she said she couldn't stand being stared at anymore. We must be the only girls in London wearing white. Just then a bus conductor said, "Hop on, snowdrops." She haughtily hailed the taxi. The lily pond was dry in Aunt Millicent's little flagged garden. I hoped the goldfish had found good homes. We unlocked the front door. I was surprised to find the hall quite bare. I hadn't realized that all the furniture had been taken away. "Does feel queer," I said when the door was closed and the sunny day shut out. "It only feels cold," said Rose. "I suppose the clothes will be in her bedroom. I wonder if she died in there." I thought it was a tactless thing to wonder out loud. On our way up, we looked in at the double drawing room. The 2 tall windows stared across the Thames. It was dazzlingly light. The last time I had seen that room, it had been lit by dozens of candles for a party. That was the night we first met Topaz. Macmorris's portrait of her had just been exhibited, and Aunt Millicent asked him to bring her with him. She wore the misty blue dress he painted her in, and he had lent her the great jade necklace. I remember being astonished at the long pale hair hanging down her back. And I remember Father talking to her all evening, and Aunt Millicent in her black velvet suit and lace stocks glaring at him. There was nothing in the big front bedroom, much to my relief, though I can't say it felt as if anyone had died there, merely cold and empty. The clothes were in the little black dressing room, lying in heaps on the floor, with 2 old black leather trunks for us to pack them in. There was very little light because the green Venetian blind was down. The cord was broken, so we couldn't get it up, but we managed to tilt the slats a little. Aunt Millicent's old black military cloak lay on top of one of the heaps. It used to frighten me when I was little. I suppose it made me think of witches. It was frightening yesterday too, but in a different way. It seemed somehow to be part of a dead person. "All the clothes did," I said. "Rose, I don't think I can touch them." "We've got to," she said, and started to rummage through them. Perhaps if we had ever been fond of poor Aunt Millicent, we might have felt a kindness for her clothes. Perhaps if they had been pretty and feminine, it wouldn't been so horrible. But they were mostly heavy, dark coats, skirts, thick woolen underwear, and rows of flat-heeled shoes on wooden trees, which upset me most of all. I kept thinking of them as dead feet. "There are dozens of linen handkerchiefs. That's something," said Rose. But I hated the handkerchiefs, and the gloves, and the stockings, and the dreadful pair of broken-looking corsets. "People's clothes ought to be buried with them," I said. "They oughtn't to be left behind to be despised." "I'm not despising them," said Rose. "Some of these suits are made of wonderful cloth." But she was bundling them into the trunks in a somehow insulting way. I made myself take them out and fold them carefully, and had a mental picture of Aunt Millicent looking relieved. "She always liked her suits to be well pressed and brushed," I said. "As if it mattered to her now," said Rose. And then we heard someone coming up the stairs. I went icy cold from my heart up to my shoulders. Then the fear got into my throat so that I couldn't speak. I just stared at Rose in agony. "It isn't it?" she gasped. "Oh, Cassandra, it isn't." But I knew that she thought it was, and I knew, in the way I so often know things about Rose, that she had been frightened ever since we entered the house, that the casual way she handled the clothes had been all a bluff. But I didn't know then that she was doubly frightened, that she thought if it wasn't Aunt Millicent coming up the stairs, it was a tramp who had been hiding in the basement, that he would kill us both and put our bodies in the trunks. "Oh, wonderful, Rose!" With both these fears in her mind, she opened the door and said, "Who's there?" The lawyer's clerk stood outside. "How dare you? How dare you?" she cried furiously. "Sneaking into the house, terrifying my little sister." "Don't, Rose," I said in a weak voice. The poor clerk apologized profusely. And I only came to do you a good turn, he finished. Then he handed her a letter. Rose read it. But we can't pay this. I snatched it from her. It was a reminder that money was owing for the cold storage of some furs. You don't have to pay anything. I fixed that by telephone, said the clerk. We're your aunt's executors, so we get her bills, see? That was actually on my desk when you came in this morning, but I hadn't got around to reading it. Those are your furs now. But Aunt Millicent never had any furs, I said. She thought they were cruel to animals, and I always thought she was right. Well, those belong to her, said the clerk. And cruel or not, you'd better pop along and get them. Furs are worth money. I looked at the letter again. It didn't say what the furs were. They must be good ones if she paid out all that to store them, said the clerk. Tell you what, you shove all this stuff in the trunks and I'll take them down to the station. Leave them in the left luggage office for you, see? And you cut along for the furs. We bundled the clothes in hurriedly. I am ashamed to say I forgot about Aunt Millicent's dead feelings. The clerk and his taxi driver dragged the trunks downstairs. Then he got another taxi for us. Wish I could come with you to see the fun, he said, but I'm due in the courts at 3. His hair was oily and his complexion spotty, but his heart was kind. Rose evidently thought so too, because she leaned out of the taxi and said she was sorry she had been so cross. Don't mention it, he said. I'm sure I'd have given myself a fright if I'd seen you. Then the taxi started and he shouted after us, Here's hoping they're sables. We hope so too. They must be fairly new, as she didn't have them when we knew her, said Rose. I expect her principles dwindled as she got older and colder. They'll probably be rabbit, I said, feeling I ought to damp our imaginings. But I didn't really believe Aunt Millicent would have worn anything cheap. The taxi drew up at a wonderful shop, the sort of shop I would never dare to walk through without a reason. We went in by way of the glove and stocking department, but there were things from other departments just dotted about, bottles of scent and a little glass tree with cherries on it, and a piece of white-branched coral on a sea-green chiffon scarf. Oh, it was an artful place. It must make people who have money want to spend it madly. The pale gray carpets were as springy as moss, and the air was scented. It smelt like a bit of bluebells, but richer, deeper. What does it smell of exactly? I said, and Rose said, heaven. There was a different scent in the fur department, heavier, and the furs themselves had an exciting smell. There were lots of them lying about on the gray satin sofas, deep brown, golden brown, silvery, and there was even a young fair mannequin walking about in an ermine cape over a pink gauze dress with a little muff. A woman with blue-white hair came and asked if she could help us, and took away our storage bill, and after a while 2 men in white coats came in with Aunt Millicent's furs and dumped them on the sofa. We shook them out and examined them. There were 2 very long coats, one of them black and shaggy, and the other smoothish and brown, a short black tight-fitting jacket with leg of mutton sleeves, and a large hairy rug with a green felt border. But whatever animals were they? I gasped. The white-haired woman inspected them gingerly. She said the brown coat was beaver, the short jacket, which had a rusty look under its black, was sealskin. She couldn't identify the rug at all. It looked like a collie dog to me. Rose tried the long shaggy black coat on. It reached on the ground. You look like a bear, I said. It is bear, said the white-haired woman. Dear me, I think it must have been a coachman's coat. There's something in the pocket, said Rose. She drew out a piece of paper. On it was scrawled, Meet Madam's train, 1:20. Miss Millie to dance class at 3. The young ladies to the Grange at 6. I worked it out. Aunt Millicent was father's youngest sister. These furs must have been her mother's. That made them heavens, I cried. These belonged to our great-grandmother. A sort of manager person came and talked to us. We asked him if there was anything valuable. You couldn't get the beaver today for love or money, he said, but I don't know if you can sell it for much. We treat furs so differently now. It weighs a ton. The shop didn't buy second-hand furs, and he couldn't advise us where to take them. We felt that London was the most likely place to sell them in, and wanted to leave them until we could get advice from Topaz, but he said that if we stayed any longer they would run into another quarter's storage charges, and Aunt Millicent's lawyers probably wouldn't pay any more, so we said we would take them over our arms. It seemed the only way. We signed things and then loaded up. On the way out, we looked through the archway to the department we had come in by. There was a woman buying pale blue suede gloves. She wore the plainest little black suit, but Rose thought it looked wonderful. "That's how we ought to dress," she said. We stood there staring at the scent and stockings and things. We saw one woman buy a dozen pairs of silk stockings, until I said, "We're like Ab when he sees a bird fly past the window. At any moment we'll let out wistful cat noises." Rose said she felt just like that. "Well, let's walk around the whole shop while we're in it," I suggested, but she couldn't bear to, loaded up with furs. So I put my head through the archway and took one big sniff of the bluebell scent, and then we went out of the main door, which was close at hand. Rose wanted to take the furs straight back to the city by taxi, but there wasn't one to be seen, and I was so ravenous that I persuaded her we ought to have something to eat first. We tottered to Oxford Street. Those furs certainly did weigh tons, and found a place with nice white tablecloths and great round cruets. It was a bit of a business getting ourselves settled. We tried folding the furs and sitting on them, but then found we could reach neither the floor nor our plates. In the end, we had to dump everything down beside us, which was rather unpopular with the waitress. But I did like the restaurant. Most of the people eating there were unusually ugly, but the food was splendid. We had roast chicken, wing portion, 2 shillings, double portions of bread sauce, each, 2 vegetables, treacle pudding, and wonderfully milky coffee. We were gloriously bloated. By the time we finished it, it was getting on to 4 o'clock. "We've seen hardly any of London," I said, as we drove back to the lawyer's. Rose says she wouldn't have wanted to, even if we hadn't been burdened with the furs, because it was no fun being in London in the wrong clothes. After that, she was quiet so long that I asked her what she was thinking about. "I was willing God to give me a little black suit," she said. Our friend the clerk laughed his head off at the furs, but he said it was a damned shame. He thought the beaver must have been a man's traveling coat. It was too big for him even, and that the beaver was the lining and the Scotch plaid was the right side. He gave us cups of tea and 2 squashed fly biscuits each, but we were too full to eat them, so we put them in an envelope for our journey. When we got the old leather trunks from the left for luggage office, the man there asked if there were any bodies in them. It was then Rose told me how she feared that there might have been. Ours. We had a compartment to ourselves on the train, and as it turned cold after sunset, I put on the beaver coat, first side inwards. It felt wonderfully friendly. It was extraordinary. I had the most affectionate feeling for all those furs. No horror of them at all, as I had of Aunt Millicent's clothes, though. I knew they must all have been worn by dead people. I thought about it a lot, getting warmer and warmer in the beaver, and I decided that it was like the difference between the beautiful old godsend graves and the new ones open to receive coffins, which I can never bear to look at. That time takes the ugliness and horror out of death and turns it into beauty. A year ago, I would have made a poem out of that idea. I tried to yesterday, but it wasn't any use. Oh, I would think of the lines that rhymed and scanned, but that is all that they were. I know now that is all my poems ever were. Yet I used to feel I could leap over the moon when I had made one up. I missed that, rather. I leaned back and closed my eyes, and instantly the whole day danced before me. I wasn't merely remembering it. Seemed to be trapped inside my eyelids. The city, the traffic, the shops were all there, shimmering, merging. Then my brain began to pick out the bits it wanted to think about. I realized how the day made a pattern of clothes. First our white dresses in the early morning, then the consciousness of what people were wearing in London, then Aunt Millicent's poor dead clothes, then all the exquisite things in the shops, then our furs. And I thought how important clothes were to women and always had been. I thought of Norman ladies in Belmont Tower Keep, and Plantagenet ladies living in Godsend Castle, and Stuart ladies when our house was built on the ruins, and hoops, and Jane Austen dresses, and crinolines and bustles, and Rose longing for a little black suit. I had the most profound philosophic thoughts about it all, but perhaps I dreamt them, for they all seemed to have floated away. When Rose woke me, I was dreaming of the white-branched coral on the sea-green chiffon scarf. It was time to change trains. I felt frozen when I took the beaver coat off. I thought I had better because it not only looked peculiar, but trailed on the ground. I was thankful when we were in our little branch-line train and I could put it on again. Rose put on the coachman's coat, and we each leaned out a window to smell the sweet country smell. You don't notice it unless you've been away. We still had our squash fly biscuits, so we ate them, leaning out into the night. Only I saved one of mine for Stefan, who was to meet us with Mr. Stebbins' cart to take the trunks. And then it happened. As we stopped at Little Limping, I looked towards the guard's van to make sure our trunks didn't get pulled out by mistake. The station master is a bit daft. And there, looking out the train, not 6 yards away from me, was Simon Cotton. His hair and beard looked very black. The sickly light from the platform lamps made him seem very pale, and even in that quick glance I noticed the naked look of his mouth. I dodged back in and yelled to Rose. I reckoned we had 10 minutes to think in. We were 5 miles from Scotney, and the little train crawls. But oh, I needed more time. I couldn't make up my mind if I ought to tell Rose what the Cottons had said about her. I was so frightened that if I didn't, she might be silly again. Let's be distant with them, I said while I tidied my hair in the glass between photographs of Norwich Cathedral and Yarmouth Beach. Distant? Do you think I intend to speak to them after they've ignored us? But we'll have to say good evening, won't we? We can say it coldly and sweep on with dignity, she said. We couldn't do anything with dignity dressed as we were and laden with furs and hearth rugs. She wanted us to jump out of the train as it stopped and dash away before the Cottons saw us. But we can't dash away without our trunks, I said. Then I had an idea. We'll get out on the wrong side of the train and walk along the line to the guard's van. By the time we get there, the Cottons will be out of the station. She thought it would work. We decided to keep the fur coats on so that we could be invisible in the darkness. At the end of the platform, if the Cottons looked back while we were getting the trunks. Rose turned up the huge bearskin collar to hide her bright hair. Let's hope no train comes on the other line while we're walking along, I said. But I knew it was unlikely at this time of night, and they come very slowly. Anyway, we could push these little trains back with one hand, said Rose. I hoisted the collie dog rug over my shoulder. Rose took the sealskin jacket. The instant the train stopped, we jumped down onto the line. We hadn't realized how difficult walking would be. The coats were so awkward to hold up, and we kept tripping over things. The paraffin lamps on the platform gave very weak light, and there were no lamps at all as far along the guard's van. We couldn't reach the doors on our side, so we went around back of the train and climbed up to the platform. The doors of the van were open that side, but there appeared to be no guard to put the trunks off. The station master usually helps with the luggage, but he is the ticket collector too, and I was sure he would be busy seeing the Cottons off. We must manage by ourselves, I said. The van was so dimly lit that at first we couldn't see the trunks. Then Rose spotted them at the far end behind a lot of tall milk cans. As we went over, we passed a big crate. The feeble little gas mantle was just above it, and I saw on the label Cotton, Scotney, Suffolk. Rose saw it too, and I gave a gasp. The next sound we heard were voices and steps coming along the platform. We rushed to the doorway, then realized it was too late to get out. Quick, get behind the trunks, said Rose. If I had any time to think, I might have reasoned with her, told her we should just look like such fools if we were discovered. But she bolted to the trunks, and I bolted too. They'll never see us, she said, as we crouched down. I didn't think they would either. The trunks were high and the light so weak and so far away from us. But crouch lower, I whispered. Your trunk's not as high as mine. Oh, we'll manage it between us, sir, said a man's voice. It wasn't the station master's, so I guessed it was the guard to come back. I'll help, said Neil Cotton, jumping into the van. Then he shouted, My God! And jumped out again. The next instant the doors crashed together with such violence that the gas mantle broke, leaving us in blackness. What is it? What's the matter? Shouted Simon Cotton. I couldn't hear what Neil answered, but I heard the guard give a roar of laughter. Well, that's all good, that is... Oh, Rose, he saw us, I whispered. Rubbish. Why would he slam the doors on us? She whispered back. No, it's something else. Shut up. Listen. I raised my head cautiously. I could just see the outline of the window, a little open at the top. I heard Simon Cotton say, Neil, you're crazy. I can tell you I'm certain. I've been sitting in that van, said the guard, but you left the doors open. I saw a faint blur moving in the darkness. It was Rose's face, coming up behind her trunk. What is it? She whispered desperately. Shh, I said. straining my ears. I think I shall remember that minute as long as I live. The stars in the square of the window, the bead of light above the broken mantel, the smell of stale milk and fish. I heard Simon Cotton say he could get a flashlight from the car. "And tell Mother to stay inside with the door shut," Neil called after him. Rose began to crawl towards the window. There was a hollow clang. She collided with a milk can. The guard gave a low whistle. "Sounds like you're right, sir." "Of course I'm right," said Neil. "Haven't I fed them in Yellowstone Park?" And then it dawned on me. "Rose," I said, "you've been mistaken for a bear." I heard her gasp. "The idiot! The idiot!" Then she clanged into another milk can. "Well, 7/8 of you is a bear, and the circus is at King's Crypt. The tents were close to the railway line. The Cottons couldn't have missed seeing them." I began to laugh but stopped when I heard her struggling with the doors on the far side of the van. She got them open, and I saw her back against the stars. "Come on, quick," she said as she jumped down onto the line. I got across the doorway, and every milk can clanged into the next one to it. Above the din, I could hear Neil Cotton and the guard running along the platform and shouting at the engine driver. "Oh, Rose, don't be a fool," I cried. "We'll have to explain." She grabbed my hands and pulled until I had to jump. "If you don't come with me, I'll never forgive you," she whispered fiercely. "I'd rather die than explain." "Then you probably will die, because lots of people in the country have guns handy." But it was no use. She had vanished into the darkness at the back of the train. Passengers were shouting and banging doors. There couldn't have been many of them, but they were making a devil of a noise. Fortunately, they were concentrating on the platform side of the train. It suddenly came to me that if I could make Rose take off her coat, we could join in the pursuit, as if we had no connection with the bear. So I struggled out of my own coat, flung it up onto the van, and started after her. But before I had gone a couple of yards, the beam of a torch shone out. I saw Rose clearly. She had got beyond the end of the platform and was scrambling up the little embankment. And, as she was on all fours, she really did look exactly like a bear. There was a wild shout from the people on the platform. Rose topped the embankment and disappeared over into the fields. "Foxearth's Farm's over there," shouted a woman. "They've got 3 little children." I heard someone running along the platform. The woman yelled, "Quick, quick, over to Foxearth." There was a thump as someone jumped down onto the line. Then Stefan crossed the beam of the torch. The light gleamed on metal, and I realized he was carrying a pitchfork. It must have been in Mr. Stebbins' cart. "Stop, Stefan, stop!" I screamed. He turned and shouted, "I won't hurt it unless I have to, Miss Cassandra. I'll head into a barn." Neil Cotton went past me. "Here, give me that," he said, grabbing Stefan's pitchfork. Simon came running along, shooting his torch ahead of him. The guard and some of the passengers came pounding after him, and somebody crashed into me, knocked me over. The torch began to flicker on and off. Simon thumped it, and then it went out altogether. "Get the station's lanterns," shouted the guard, scrambling back onto the platform. The passengers waited for him, but Simon and Stefan went on after Neil into the darkness. Perhaps I ought to have explained at once, but what with the noise and being knocked down, I was a bit dazed, and I knew how ghastly it would be for Rose, not only the Cottons knowing, but all the local people on the train, and I did think she had a good chance to get away. Anyway, Neil will see she's not a bear if he gets close to her, I told myself. Then they all came thudding past with the lanterns, and the station master had his great black dog on a chain and a stone in his hand. I knew it wasn't safe to keep quiet any longer. I started to tell them, but the dog was barking so loudly that nobody heard me. And then, high above everything, I heard the most piercing shriek. I lost my head completely. "It's my sister!" I screamed. "He's killing her!" And I dashed off along the line. They all came after me shouting, and someone fell over the dog's chain and cursed extensively. We climbed over the embankment into the field, and the men held the lanterns high, but we couldn't see Rose or the Cottons or Stefan. Everyone was talking at once, making suggestions. There was a fat woman who wanted the station master to let his dog off the chain, but he was afraid it might bite the Cottons instead of the bear. "But it'll hug them to death," moaned the fat woman. "They won't have a chance." I opened my mouth to make them understand that there wasn't any bear, and then I saw something white in the distance. The men with the lanterns saw it too and ran towards it. And suddenly Neil Cotton walked into the light, carrying Rose in her white suit. Simon Cotton and Stephen were a few steps behind. The fat woman hurried forward. "Stand back, please," said Neil Cotton firmly. "She's had a dreadful shock." "Rose! Rose!" I cried, running to her. "She's all right," said Simon Cotton quickly, "but we want to get her to our car." He grabbed one of the lanterns, lit the way for Neil, and they walked solidly on. "But the bear, sir," said the guard. "Dead," said Simon Cotton. "My brother killed it." "Are you sure?" said the station master. "We better have a look," said the fat woman. "The dog'll soon find it." "No, it won't," said Neil Cotton over his shoulder. "It fell in the river and was carried away by the current." "Poor thing, poor thing, it didn't have a chance," wailed the fat woman. "Killed first and drowned afterwards. And I dare say it was valuable." "You go with your sister," Simon Cotton told me, and I was only too glad to. He handed the lantern to Stephen and stayed behind, urging the people back to the train. "Well, it's a rum go," said the station master. It was certainly a rum go as far as I was concerned. "What happened, Stephen?" I asked under my breath. Rose suddenly raised her head and whispered fiercely, "Shut up! Get the trunks off the train!" Then, as Neil was carrying her carefully down the little embankment, I heard her tell him they could get out through the field at the back of the station. He crossed the line with her and went straight into it. They never went back to the station at all. Stephen lit them with the lantern for a minute or two, then joined me in the guard's van. Before I could get a word out, he said, "Please, please don't ask me any questions yet, Miss Cassandra." I was throwing the beaver coat and the rug and the jacket out onto the platform. "Well, at least you can tell me where the bear coat is," I began. But then the guard came back. Poor man, he couldn't make out how the bear had got out of the van. I told him Rose had been in there when Neil Cotton slammed the doors, and had opened the far side doors when she heard the bear growling. "It was after her like a stake," I said. That seemed to clear things up nicely. The station master helped us get the trunks onto Mr. Stebbins' cart. The Cotton's car was only a few yards away, and there was Rose inside it talking to Mrs. Cotton. Simon Cotton came out of the station and said to me, "We're driving your sister home. Will you come too?" But I said I would stay with Stephen. It was partly embarrassment and partly that I was afraid I would say the wrong thing, not having the faintest idea what had really happened. And I couldn't get anything out of Stephen on the way home. All he would say was, "Oh, it was dreadful. Dreadful. Miss Rose had better tell you herself. I'm saying nothing." I had to wait until she and I were in bed last night for anything like the whole story. Oh, she gave us all a brief outline as soon as she got home, but I guessed she was holding things back. All she told us then was that Neil Cotton came rushing at her with the pitchfork. She screamed, and then suddenly he got the hang of things and told Simon and Stephen to pretend there really had been a bear. Neil and Simon even pretended it to their mother, she said. Oh, they were marvelous. I never heard Father laugh so much. He said the story would be built up and embroidered until Rose had been pursued by a herd of stampeding elephants. And he was greatly impressed by the Cottons' quick-mindedness. They hadn't come in, just left Rose in the courtyard. Neil said they'd leave me to tell the story in my own way, she said. And now I've told it. And you'll all have to pretend there really was a bear, forever and ever. She was ablaze with excitement, not in the least upset at having been so conspicuous. It was I who was upset. I don't know why. Perhaps I was just overtired. I suddenly began to shiver and wanted to cry. Topaz hurried us to bed and brought us cocoa and hot bricks for our feet, and I soon felt better. She kissed us in a motherly way that Rose doesn't appreciate and told us not to talk too long. I think she wanted to stay and talk herself, but Father yelled for her to come along to bed. "Let's finish our cocoa in the dark," I said and blew out the candle. Rose is always more confidential in the dark. The first thing she said was, "How much did Stephen tell you on the way home?" I told her how he had said it was too dreadful to tell. "I wondered if he'd seen," she said, then began to giggle. The first time for months. The giggles became muffled and I guessed she was stifling them with her pillow. At last she came up for air and said, "I slapped Neil Cotton's face." "Rose!" I gasped. "Why?" She said she had looked around and seen him coming, seen the pitchfork against the sky, and let out the scream we heard. Then I tried to get out of the coat, but I couldn't find the buttons. So I went on running. He yelled, "Stop! Stop! He must have seen by then that I wasn't really a bear. Then he caught up with me and grabbed me by the arm. I said, "Let go, damn you!" And Stefan heard my voice and called out, "It's Miss Rose!" Neil Cotton shouted, "But why are you running away?" And I said, "Because I don't want to meet you or your brother either. You can both go to hell." And I hit him across the face. Oh, Rose. I felt all knotted up by the awfulness of it. What did he say? He said, "Good God." And then Simon and Stefan came up, and Stefan said, "All the people on the train were out after me." "That's your fault," I said to Neil Cotton. "You've made me a laughingstock of the neighborhood." And he said, "Wait, be quiet." Then he told them to pretend there really had been a bear, as I told you. "Don't you think it was wonderfully kind of him?" I asked. She said, "Yes, in a way," then stopped, and I knew she was trying to work out something in her mind. At last she went on, "But it's all part of his not taking us seriously. Not just us, but England generally. He wouldn't have dared to pretend anything so silly in America, I bet. He thinks England's a joke. A funny sort of toy. Toy trains, toy countryside. I could tell that by the way he talked coming home in the car." I knew what she meant. I had felt in a bit that night they first came to the castle. Not with Simon, though, and I'm sure Neil doesn't mean it unkindly. I asked what the mother was like. "Beautiful, and never stops talking. Father'll want to brain her with a brick, if he ever meets her." "He'll meet her all right. We shall be seeing quite a lot of the Cottons now." Her tone was so confident, almost arrogant, that I was frightened for her. "Oh, Rose, don't be silly with them this time." I had said it before, but I couldn't stop myself. She simply pounced on it. "What do you mean, silly? Did Topaz say I was?" I said I was merely guessing, but she wouldn't leave it at that. She battered me with questions, what with wanting to defend Topaz and being very tired. I wasn't as strong-minded as I ought to have been, and Topaz had said it might be best to tell if we got another chance with the Cottons. But I felt perfectly dreadful when I had told, mean both to the Cottons and Rose. Still, if it does her any good, and I was careful to stress about my being consciously naive. I left out the bit about father. She wanted to know which brother had said the worst things. I sorted the remarks out best I could. "Well, at least Simon was sorry for me," she said. "It was Neil who suggested to drop us. Oh, how I'll pay them out." "Don't count it against them," I begged. "Look how very kind they were tonight. And if you're sure they want to be friends now, I'm sure all right. Did they say anything about seeing us again?" "Never mind what they said." And then to my surprise she started to giggle again. She wouldn't tell me why. When she stopped, she said she was sleepy. I tried to keep her talking by being Miss Blossom. "Here, Rosie, have you something up your sleeve, you naughty girl?" But she wasn't having any. "If I have, it's staying here," she said. "You and Miss Blossom go to sleep." But I lay awake for ages, going over it all. Heavens, Godsend church clock has just struck 4. I have been riding up here on the mound for 6 hours. Topaz never rang the lunch bell for me. Instead, she brought me out some milk and 2 big cheese sandwiches, and a message from father that I was to write as long as I liked. It seems selfish when the others are working hard on Aunt Millicent's clothes, but while we were unpacking them this morning, I began to shake again. When Topaz found out what I felt about them, she said I had better write it out of my system. I think I have, because I can now look down on them flapping on the line without any horror, though I don't feel fond of them yet as I do the furs. Stefan cycled to Scotney Station before he went to work and brought back the bear coat. It was hidden in a ditch. Father can remember hearing about this coat when he was little. He said most coachmen were lucky if they got a short goatskin cape to wear in the winter, but great-grandmother said that if her husband who rode beside the carriage had a beaver-lined coat, the coachman out in the cold ought to be at least as warmly dressed. He was grateful for the bear coat, but embarrassed, as little boys used to jeer and ask him to dance. The sealskin jacket was Aunt Millicent's in the 90s before she turned against furs. Father thinks she kept all of these out of family sentiment, and perhaps because she was only happy as a child. How queer to think that the old lady in the black military cloak was the Miss Millie who went to the dancing class. It makes me wonder what I shall be like when I'm old. My hand is very tired, but I want to go on writing. I keep resting and thinking. All day I have been 2 people. Me imprisoned in yesterday and the me out here on the mound. And now there is a third me trying to get in. The me in what is going to happen next. Will the Cottons ask us to Scotney? Topaz thinks they will. She says the oddness of the bear incident will fascinate them, just as they were fascinated by the oddness of the first night they came to the castle, and that Rose running away will have undone the damage she did by being too forthcoming. If only she doesn't forthcome again. Topaz approves of my telling her last night. She had a talk with her herself about it this morning, and Rose listened with surprising civility. Just be rather quiet and do a lot of listening until you feel at ease, Topaz advised her. And for pity's sake, don't be challenging. Your looks will do the challenging if you give them the chance. I do love Topaz when she is in a down-to-earth mood. Is it awful to join in this planning? Is it trying to sell one's sister? But surely Rose can manage to fall in love with them. I mean, with whichever one will fall in love with her. I hope it will be Neil, because I really do think Simon is a little frightening. Only it is Neil who thinks England is a joke. I have been resting, just staring down at the castle. I wish I could find words, serious, beautiful words to describe it. In the afternoon sunlight, the more I strive for them, the more they utterly elude me. How can one capture the pool of light in the courtyard, the golden windows, the strange long ago look, the look that one sees in old paintings? I can only think of the light of other days, and I didn't make that up. Oh, I have just seen the Cottons' car on the Godsend Road, near the High Cross where one gets a first glimpse of the castle. They're coming here! Do I watch and wait again? No, no fear. I'm going down.